This is the fifth video in a six-part series on why evolution is a religious theory. Now, in the first four videos, we focused on Charles Darwin and his development of the theory of evolution. And we found that the theory of evolution was theologically laden. But what about after Darwin? Because evolutionists will sometimes say, well, things changed after Darwin. Okay, maybe Darwin had a religious axe to grind. Maybe he had religious motives. Maybe his theory was theologically laden. Okay, whatever. But after Darwin, it changed. The theory grew up. It became scientific. In particular, there were no appeals, no theological claims like you see in The Origin, Charles Darwin's 1859 book on evolution. Chock full of theological claims. You don't see that any longer. You don't see those theological arguments, those arguments based on theological claims that were so critical to his advancement of the theory. After 1859, after Darwin, when evolutionists were trying to prove the theory or demonstrate that the theory is true, that evolution is true, you don't find those theological claims. It's just the scientific evidence, empirical science. So what about that rebuttal? Well, this is our fifth rebuttal, and it too, like the previous four, is just plain false, very clearly false. If you look at the literature after Darwin, later in the 19th century and throughout the 20th century and on up till today, it is full of the same sorts of theological claims that Darwin made. Yes, the evidences have evolved, they've changed, we have better science, we have more scientific data, but they're fitted into the same theological arguments that Charles Darwin made. You see it over and over again. Now you can see the paper, a link is down below for the details on that. I'll give you a couple of examples. Dilley and Nicholas have a good 2019 journal article where they surveyed 32 biology and science textbooks. Now these are contemporary textbooks at the high school and undergraduate level, and what Dilley and Nicholas found was that the same sorts of theological arguments straight out of The Origin, straight out of the work of Charles Darwin, have persisted, and they show up in these textbooks. They're pervasive in these textbooks. So it's become a textbook orthodoxy. Certain arguments are used over and over again to prove the veracity of evolution, demonstrate that evolution is true. Nothing has changed. Aside from textbooks, what about the rest of the evolutionary literature? Evolutionists write books and articles and so forth on why evolution is true. These are leading top evolutionists from around the world. What do they say? Well, it's the same story. You find the same theological arguments, the same metaphysical premises in these popular books and articles on why evolution must be true. You can see the paper for several examples and a survey of this. For now, I'll just show you one example from Jerry Cohen in his book, Why Evolution is True. Cohen writes, "One of nature's worst designs is shown by the recurrent laryngeal nerve of mammals. Running from the brain to the larynx, this nerve helps us speak and swallow. The curious thing is that it is much longer than it needs to be. In giraffes, the nerve takes a similar path, but one that runs all the way down that long neck and back up again, a distance 15 feet longer than the direct route. This circuitous path of the recurrent laryngeal nerve is not only poor design, it might even be maladaptive." So there you have it. Now, this book of Cohen's is chock full of these sorts of arguments. This is not an exception. This is the rule. Every page, practically, you'll find one of these sorts of arguments. So what can we say about this? Well, I want to make a few observations about this bad design argument, or poor design, or disutility sorts of arguments. First, it's terribly naive. In biology, there are many different functions that structures fulfill, even at the genetic level. Just look at a simple gene, something that we didn't understand years ago, but now are better understanding that your typical gene has multiple functions. It's very complicated. So when evolutionists say that something is a bad design, it doesn't work very well, it's terribly naive. For example, a Boeing 747 jet airliner is terrible at getting groceries from the grocery down the street. That doesn't mean it's a bad design. And in that recurrent laryngeal nerve example that we just read about from Cohen, it's more complicated than Cohen lets on. The recurrent laryngeal nerve does innervate tissue on its way down and on the way back up. It's a little more complicated, and it's naive to say that, well, it's just a bad design. It's also presumptuous. Have we ever designed an organism? Have we ever designed a frog or an oak tree or something like that? Much less the entire biological world with millions and millions of species and all of the ecosystems? Of course not. We really don't know the answer to these things. It's presumptuous to say, well, no, that's obviously a bad design. So if these arguments are naive and if they're presumptuous, well, how have they fared? Well, there's the proof of it, because they have not fared well. Evolutionary thought has a terrible track record, a terrible history of making these claims. They typically have turned out to be false. Evolutionists, when they first see something, think, oh, this is terrible, this is a bad design, it's a claptrap. Well, then science comes along and finds out, oh, actually, there's something very subtle going on here. There's something nuanced, it's very interesting, it's very complex, and so forth. Inevitably, the science reveals something more interesting than, oh, it's just a bad design. So what we're really seeing here is that these arguments are theory-laden. You see, if you're an Epicurean, that's the way you're going to see the world. If you think the world has arisen by chance factors, it must have arisen by chance factors, it must have arisen by itself, then you're going to see things as a claptrap. Things just happen to come about, and whenever you look at something, it's like, oh, that's not working very well. These arguments say more about the evolutionist than they do about the structure that they're talking about. Now next, these arguments are not empirical. This is not empirical science. The key here is to understand that these arguments are used to prove evolution. They're not merely used to prove the fitness value of a biological structure or something like that. They're used to prove evolution. Now how does that work? That seems a little odd. You find a structure that doesn't look right, doesn't work very well, and that proves evolution? Well, how do you figure that? They prove evolution by virtue of disproving, falsifying creation. No creator would have done it that way. That's religious. That's not empirical science. There is a long, long history of these arguments, and today's arguments are no different. 2,000 years ago, Epicureans were making the same argument. 200 years ago, people were making the same argument. 20 years ago, people were making the same argument. Today's arguments are no different. When you look at and when you understand the history of all this, it really falls into place. Religion drives science, and it matters.